Dr. Chiu, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure, Brody.
Awesome. I found your information through a friend of mine and was just so intrigued about your story. And we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit later. But first, I wanted to start about your specialty, which is concussions. What exactly is a concussion and what's going on in the brain?
Yeah, great question. So I found that a lot of people have this misunderstanding about concussions, including, some practitioners. So a concussion is a trauma to the brain, but the thing is, you actually don't even need a head trauma to sustain a concussion. For example, I've had patients who were riding a bike and they went mountain biking and fell off their bike, landed on their arm, didn't break a bone or anything or hit their head, but they ended up with a concussion because the force from that fall traveled up their arm into their body and into their brain.
Mm.
I've also had some patients who were in a car accident where they had whiplash, but they didn't hit their head on the steering wheel or on the dashboard. Just the back and forth movement of their head again caused the concussion. So that's the thing. Concussions are a trauma to the brain, but you don't even need a actual head injury to sustain a concussion. That's why I think they're one of the most overlooked reasons for a lot of different brain symptoms. A lot of times I've worked with patients who, they didn't, I specialize in concussion now, but prior I would have patients come to my office with all types of strange brain symptoms or even chronic gut issues, and they didn't even realize that it all started after they had a concussion because they didn't realize they had a concussion to begin with. It was through a process of really listening to their story and understanding their situation. So, yeah, I really think that concussions are a silent epidemic. A lot of people are walking around struggling with concussion symptoms and they don't even realize it. On top of that, even if they do realize it, unfortunately, a lot of the conventional approach, the standard of care for concussions simply doesn't cut it. A lot of my patients who I've worked with, unfortunately, they might have had a concussion and they're having symptoms like brain fog or neural fatigue or light and sound sensitivity or headaches. They go to their doctor and their doctor might talk to them for like 5 minutes or so, maybe run a test or two. And even if they do a test, many times the tests are normal, right? And so they end up leaving feeling discouraged or just with a bunch of medications to suppress their symptoms. And don't get me wrong, sometimes those medications are needed to help a person just get through the day. I totally get it.
Mm.
But my problem with that is it's not addressing the underlying root cause. It's like if all of a sudden you had a fire alarm going off in your bedroom or in your kitchen and you called the specialist and they came over to your house and they investigated everything and they said, "Oh, we've identified the source of the fire alarm," and they removed the battery. you know so that might be able to help you get to bed at night, but obviously if you don't address the underlying reasons why there's smoke or where the fire is in the first place, your house can burn down. So yeah, so that's the thing, concussions, I think they're a big deal, you know, and I think they're one of the most overlooked reasons why a lot of people are continuing to struggle with their health. And unfortunately, the standard of care right now isn't what it needs to be to help those millions of people still struggling with concussion.
I totally agree, but that was a real eye opener for me because I had no idea that a sudden movement, maybe if you're on a roller coaster or let's say I'm making a dynamic movement with my body that could potentially cause a concussion. Can you speak a little bit more about how we can avoid that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the tricky part too. It's like what I've seen in the research and what I experienced myself is when you have one, concussion, they tend to add up,
Mhm.
right? So it's like if you have one, I can't tell you how many times I've worked with patients who they reach out to me and I talk to them, they're like, I've had actually multiple concussions in my life But in the past, it was kind of like I'd shake it off, and within a day or two, I'd be fine and get back on my bike. I, get back on the snowboard or get back to work and just be working really hard, whatever. But it was this one last time, and the bump wasn't even that heavy, right, or that hard, and it's like everything fell apart. And so that's the thing, is these things build up over time. But therein lies the good news, right? The good news is it's not that they build up over time, it's because we understand why they are cumulative, why they add up. And what actually ends up happening is, when you have a concussion, there's a physical trauma. And again, it doesn't even have to be the head, right? But to the brain, you have a physical trauma that triggers a chemical trauma. What ends up happening is, once you have that physical trauma to your brain, you have a release of inflammatory chemicals that we call cytokines. And if that inflammation doesn't get shut off, that could then lead to this buildup over time. And so each time someone has another bump or concussion, right, that inflammation starts to build up over time, leading to more and more symptoms. But therein lies, like I said, the good news is, because we understand that, there's a lot of things we can do to help not only heal the brain after a concussion, but also help protect the brain from sustaining future concussions, right? And
Mhm.
so one of the key things that I've learned in that whole process of protecting the brain is making sure a person's overall inflammatory state is is not, out of control. And there's a lot of natural things, sometimes simple things you can do at home to make sure that inflammation is under check.
Got it. Very well said, man. That's it's all about kind of what you do like on a day-to-day basis. And I wanted to know a little bit more about the root cause idea, and how do you get to the root cause of the people that you're working with?
Yeah, absolutely. And, I developed this after, as you know, many years of trial and error, because over 21 years ago, I was in a terrible car accident that nearly took my life. I
Oh,
was hit by a car. I was on a scooter on my way to work. I was hit by a car, flew off the scooter, ended up with broken bones, like road rash, a dislocated shoulder. And thankfully, I survived. And I was wearing a helmet at the time,
yeah,
because if I wasn't, I wouldn't be here talking to you, Brody. And so I survived, but I ended up with chronic pain and a concussion. And everything that I tried within conventional medicine just didn't work, right? It gave me temporary relief, but I didn't like the side effects that a lot of the medications, you know, like caused.
mhm,
And also intuitively, I just knew that there had to be more to it. So I actually went outside the box just like you, and I went back to school, and
yeah,
I did a postdoc in clinical neurology. I got a master's in nutrition. I studied chiropractic, acupuncture, even things like energy medicine, anything I could get my hands on
yeah,
to figure out what was going on with my brain and body.
mhm,
And I'm so glad that I did, because along the way, I actually tinkered with my own nervous system, and I applied a lot of the things that I learned in school and at conferences and reading books to my own healing and recovery. And after many years of trial and error, I was able to fully recover from that concussion. And yeah, one of the biggest things that I discovered along the way is that concussions, there's no two brains that are alike, number
right,
one. And then number two, no two concussions are alike. And
mhm,
so one of the most important things I learned is, in order to give yourself the best fighting chances at a full recovery, you got to figure out what your root causes are. Obviously with a concussion, there's physical trauma, but what are the things underneath the surface that are keeping you back from healing? Because I actually firmly believe that the brain and body have a wisdom.
mhm.
And if we give the brain what it needs and remove what it doesn't, then healing is possible. But the trick is then identifying what those things are. Like, what are the things that are harming your brain? What are the root causes as to why you're not healing? And then, just as important, are what are the unique things that your brain needs to heal?
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's such an empowering story because I myself, I've had a wild story, so to speak. I um, got knocked out by a bouncer one time. Was laid on the street, woke up. You know, woke up the next day in the hospital, and they were telling me what happened. On top
Wow.
of that, I also abused my body in my 20s with alcohol and drugs. I also was having around 3 grand mal seizures a month, uh,
Mm.
due to a cavernous malformation in my left frontal lobe. And Dr. Chu, you know very well the left frontal lobe influences decision making, impulse control.
Oh
And so
yeah.
at that time, I was wondering, I have to give myself some credence because I was making really poor decisions, but the frontal lobe is our decision making center. But when I learned about the science of neuroplasticity, it really empowered me. And so I want
Yeah.
to speak about your knowledge of neuroplasticity and kind of how that changed some perspectives in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for sharing your story. That's the tricky thing. You know, I didn't know all the details of it, but I found myself in a similar situation too. It's like that's what I think. The statistic is 85% people who have concussion, they recover within a few weeks, right?
Hmm.
And then
Mhm.
there's the 15%, the unlucky 15% who have symptoms months, sometimes years afterwards. I was part of that unlucky 15%.
Yeah.
But when I think back on it now, and again, it's not about judging or should have, could have, would have. It's like it's important to give ourselves grace and compassion to it. But yeah, I think part of the reason why I wasn't healing is because number one, I didn't even know I had a concussion for a while,
Mhm.
right? And then
Yeah.
number two, I wasn't making the best decisions. I was in my 20s, just like you know. But the cool thing is, it's like through that whole process, not only was I able to heal my concussion, but a lot of the things that I learned about myself and the decisions that I made, right, helped to not only help me heal from that, but these are things that I continue to do day to day that help maintain my brain health, right? And so not only when we talk about neuroplasticity, a lot of the principles from that we can use to heal from concussion and trauma, but we
Mhm.
can also take a healthy brain to a whole new level, right? And
I love.
so, but that was the thing, it's like, I think one of the, I think, not I wouldn't say mistakes, but misconceptions out there is like people are looking for a cure for concussion or trauma. And what I've learned is there's no cure per se. It's more like, okay, if there was a trauma, some things within the brain and nervous system got out of balance, right? And the good news is the miracle of neuroplasticity, through that we can actually regrow brain cells, we can strengthen connections that have been injured, and through that process we can bring balance back to the brain, right? But that being said, it's like what I've learned is, and through that whole 21-year journey exploring different treatment technologies, like the latest in photobiomodulation and vagus nerve activation, electroceuticals, right, nutraceuticals, all this like advanced lab testing. What I've learned is those treatments are necessary sometimes to help jumpstart the brain, right? There's a lot of cutting edge technologies and advanced treatments,
Mhm.
but right, in my own experience and working with thousands of patients, what I've learned is even through treatments and getting someone to a better place, for example, if I didn't continue with those rituals, right, that we're kind of
Yeah.
talking about, making better choices, then I would find myself in a similar situation or worse, right? But again, it's a taking it one day at a time, and meeting yourself where you're at, and also allowing yourself grace. But yeah, that's the interesting thing too, Brody, right? With the frontal lobe, that's the seat of self-awareness.
Yeah.
And like dudes and guys typically don't grow their prefrontal cortex and frontal lobes until later on anyways. So that, on top of, I know for me, that was one of the areas that was injured as well, was my prefrontal cortex, which, for listeners out there, it's a part of the brain that's really important for self-awareness,
Mhm.
for emotional regulation, for decision making,
Mhm.
all the things. So therein lies a trap too. And so
Right.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I can relate to that. So part of it is like then healing the brain, so then the brain can then help with the healing process, but there comes a point, um, you know, that I found that there's these vicious cycles when it comes to concussion, right? When you have the physical trauma, chemical trauma, then
Mhm.
that leads to further physical trauma. But then there's a certain point in the healing process where when you break that vicious cycle, then it's like the things start to, it's like a positive cycle. You know what I mean? It's like when you
Right.
start doing things, then it starts building on itself in a positive direction,
Like a
leading.
snowball effect, kind of.
Yeah, exactly. But the key is it's like you got to figure out why you're in that vicious cycle to begin with. But
Right.
once you do, and you can remove those blocks to healing, then it is this positive, like you said, a snowball effect. But yeah, and the beauty is again with the miracle of neuroplasticity, going back to your original question, healing is possible. And neuroplasticity is this amazing ability of our nervous systems to strengthen connections. Because just to kind of step back for a second, all of our life's experiences, it boils down to brain function, right? Our ability to sit down and listen to this podcast and make sense of it, our
Mhm.
ability, like we were saying before, to have self-awareness, to be able to learn new things, but even our ability to just move around in the world without feeling dizzy or out of balance or in pain, all of that boils down to how well our brain's functioning. And the health of our brain boils down to the health of our brain cells. And more specifically, the connections, the communication pathways between our brain cells. So it's kind of like, prior to the concussion, maybe I didn't have like the fastest, highest speed internet in my brain, but it wasn't like dial-up modem, right? It
Yeah.
was like somewhere in between, and I was pretty good. But then after the concussion, those connections, the communication pathways, they got like muffled, right? And so the communication got muffled. And so from there, I started to experience symptoms like brain fog
Mhm.
and vertigo and light and sound sensitivity and stress, just like stress that I wasn't able to manage. Right. But again, because of this miracle of neuroplasticity, the brain, you can do things to trigger those connections to strengthen again. And when you have faster communication between your brain cells, that's when you start to get your life back and feel normal again. So
Yeah.
and yeah, as you know, there's a lot of different ways that we can trigger neuroplasticity.
That's beautiful. And I really urge any listeners, if you're a male and you're in your 20s, if I could go back in time, if I had a time machine, I would have told my younger self about neuroplasticity and to really, in your 20s, you're in a more vulnerable state, I would say, as your brain and prefrontal cortex is still growing. So if I could go back, I'd say, Brody, maybe take it easy on the alcohol because this is going to affect things and it's going to affect your decision making. But anyhow, I wanted to talk about some of your amazing brain performance hacks because I've checked out your YouTube channel and there's some just amazing information about how to stimulate individual brain areas. It's kind of like how if we don't want to skip leg day, right? And the same thing goes for our brain because, if you skip leg day, you'll have these skimpy legs and big body. And it's similar to the frontal lobe, and we want to stimulate the occipital lobe and uh, all around connection making. So could you just talk about a few easy brain performance hacks anybody can do?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, by the way, thanks for sending some of those questions. So I was actually looking through my Instagram and kind of like, because there's a ton of different brain hacks that I post on here.
Yeah.
So some of them, it's pretty cool because again, it's like these simple things you can do to trigger that healing response, that neuroplasticity within your brain. And
Mhm.
all of these, the way they work is they help to increase communication. And the great thing is, just like I love your example of, strengthening your, leg day versus your back and your arms, because you can do the same thing with your brain,
Right.
because different regions of your brain have different functions, and you can do specific types of exercises or brain hacks to strengthen those different regions. So for example, there's a part of the nervous system called the temporal lobe,
Mm.
and the temporal lobe. So for those of you who are watching on video, I have a model of my brain here, and I'm showing the model of the brain. So there's the front portion of the brain, which we just talked about, the prefrontal cortex that sits right behind your forehead. And then I'm going to turn my brain model like to the side. And when you're looking from the side view, there's this little flap right here we call the temporal lobe, and it sits right pretty much, yeah, exactly, right around the ear, like a bit above the ear, sits right here. And what the temporal lobe does is it has a lot of different functions, but a part of the temporal lobe is really important for memory. So being able to remember things and recall things. That part of the temporal lobe is also important for the stress response. It actually helps us handle stressors. But
Mm.
in addition to that, the temporal lobe is also important for thinking and like clear cognition, and it's also important for processing of sounds. So, for example, the brain hack then in this situation is simply listening to music.
Mm.
Believe it or not, when you listen to music, not only like, rocking out to your favorite tunes and, jamming out, not only does it feel good for your, soul, but it actually activates your temporal lobe. And what's pretty cool is you can be really specific with this. So, for example, you have two temporal lobes, a left and a right.
Mm.
And if you want to activate more the left temporal lobe, you would listen to music. But for example, if you're in a car, you would
Mm.
put the speakers on the right side of the car because music coming
Oh,
in from your right ear will
that's
go
cool.
more preferentially to your left temporal lobe. Why is that important? Again, sometimes people who have issues with their left temporal lobe, some of the symptoms that they might experience are things like emotion problems with handling emotions, like anger, right? So a lot of times, if there's injury to the temporal lobe, there could be emotional issues, there can be memory issues, right? And in addition to that, the temporal lobe is very sensitive. It can also, when it's injured, it could lead to seizures. So
Mm.
believe it or not, something as simple as listening to music could begin soothing the temporal lobe. Whereas, for example, so for example, if you want to strengthen your left temporal lobe, you listen to music in your right ear. But if you want to strengthen your right temporal lobe, guess what? You listen to music in your left ear. So, for example, you could either set your car speakers on the left side, or you can take one earbud and just put it in the left ear.
Mm.
And what that would do, the right temporal lobe is really important for more what we call nonverbal communication. So kind of like if you're hanging out with people and you're maybe not even saying too much, but you're not so much listening to what they're saying, but how they're saying it, or maybe their body language. A lot of that is processed more in the right temporal lobe. So if you have issues kind of with, things like that, or remembering, a lot of times memory in the right temporal lobe, it relates to things like stories and storytelling. So if
Mm.
you're, if you don't have a good memory of certain things that have happened, but maybe you have a good memory of like facts and numbers, then that right temporal lobe might need a bit more strengthening. And guess what? Sometimes a simple brain hack, putting music in your left ear, can help strengthen that. But the key is, again, with any of these brain hacks, you want to make sure that you do the amount that your brain can handle. Because
Oh,
again,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. A lot of times after trauma or after concussion, our brains and nervous systems become more dysregulated and sensitive.
Right.
So just like if you've haven't worked out at at the gym for a long time, you want to go for the 100-pound weights and hit that like 50 reps, because you'll probably injure yourself. So
Yeah.
same thing, if you're more sensitive, then you might find that playing music in one ear, maybe lower the volume a bit. Sometimes I find even another brain hack related to this is you actually want to plug your ear, right? A lot of
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
are more sensitive. Here's a pro tip for you guys out there. In my clinic, when I do tests, a lot of people who've had concussions or brain inflammation, one of the most common symptoms is what? Is noise sensitivity, right? So sounds can be really triggering and, really cause irritating. But what I found is it's not always both ears that are sensitive. So a test I do on my patients, like I take a tuning fork and I hit the tuning fork and I put it by their right ear. and I observe how they react. And I do the same thing on the left ear. Observe how they react. Almost always, I have to say, Brody, 85% of the time, there's a difference from side to side. Like one ear will be a lot more reactive than the other. And I can tell because they'll make that face and they'll look upset or they'll be triggered. And I do it on the left ear as an example. And they're like, oh, nothing doing. Right. So that's really important because that sensitivity is a window again into what's happening within the nervous system. So for a person like that, the brain hack would be they can take like an earplug, right? And there's even different newer technologies like sound canceling, noise canceling earplugs, and put it in that right ear. And right there in and of itself can make a massive difference. A lot of times, and I find that for my patients and recommend it for them, right? Immediately off the bat, they're able to then go out to restaurants again and not feel so triggered, because it's not even both sides. And believe it or not, when they wear that, it's actually a form of brain hacks as well. It's like it's turning down the volume and bringing balance to the brain. So for those of you out there who don't have a tuning fork, what you can do is just take your phone, put on some music at the same volume, like set it at a certain volume, listen it in your right ear, and listen in your left ear. See if one side is a bit more irritating than the other. And guess what? That side that's more irritating, you might benefit from plugging your right ear. So yeah, a lot of different brain hacks. That one's very specific to what we call the temporal lobe. That
Mhm.
could be a game changer for a lot of people out there. By
Yeah.
the way, obviously, I am a concussion specialist, but I'm not your concussion specialist. So be sure to check with your doctor first before trying out any of these brain hacks.
So well said. What a multitude of different things that you can do. So interesting. Um, I was very curious about maybe a loaded question here, but about meditation, because meditation really helped save my life. And it's a holistic approach. It wasn't only meditation, but I can say out of all of the different things that I did for my brain, meditation was number one for me. I saw a post of yours and it mentioned how meditation sometimes is not enough. Meditation alone is not enough. And so I would like to know, number one, what is your history of meditation and how it interacts with brain trauma, and maybe some clarification upon that as well.
Yeah, great question. So, I got a lot of, comments and feedbacks about that one because that's the thing. It's like a lot of people, when we think about brain health and things we can do to train the brain, one of the first tools we think of is what? Is meditation, right? And my personal opinion of meditation is it's amazing, right? It's think about it. It's like literally with your own focused attention and your own thoughts and your own mind, you can literally change the shape and structure of your own mind. That's just crazy. Through your own thinking process, you can change the fabric of physical reality within your
Yeah.
nervous system. So, right, meditation is, I think, one of the greatest gifts that we've had that we've been introduced to, throughout the ages that it's been around in human history.
Mhm,
Now, that being said, right, from a brain training perspective or a neuro rehab perspective,
mhm,
in order to meditate, that area of our nervous system we call the prefrontal cortex, it has to be working pretty well.
mhm,
So that's why I say, for a lot of the patients, and actually my own personal experience, you know as I was going after my concussion, I tried meditation, and then when I would try to sit and think and be present with my thoughts, it felt terrible, right? I
yeah,
just felt
yeah,
so bad. And not only did I feel bad because it was difficult, but then I also felt bad about myself. I'm like, am I doing this wrong? It's like everyone talks about meditation, how it's so good. It's just like I felt like this, almost like this internal shame. It's just like I must be doing something wrong with me. So then what I realized later on, right? Again, when I learned more about and I dove into the neuroscience of meditation,
mhm,
your brain, like the higher centers of your brain, what we call the neocortex, and again, the prefrontal cortex in particular, it has to be working pretty well for us to be able to even meditate. So the analogy is like, you know, if you go to the gym and you hear that, oh, there's this one exercise that everyone has to do because it's the best exercise out there,
Yeah.
and your brain or your body's just not conditioned, and you try to do it and you end up injuring yourself, right? So that's what I meant by, meditation is not enough or not the only thing. Because
Mm.
I find, again, for a lot of my patients who have had concussions, who their frontal lobes or their prefrontal lobes, their brains are inflamed, or
Mm.
there's a lot of toxins or stress. When they try to do it, it's kind of like overdoing it, right?
Right.
Overtraining. Just like what I said a second ago, Brody, it's like, yeah, I don't want people to like listen to this, be like, oh, so the what I need to do then is listen to music in my right ear, and they go home and they crank the volume and listen for that. Can actually, believe it or not, right? If your brain isn't used to that level of stimulation, you're burning a lot of energy doing that.
Mm.
The same thing applies for meditation. And
Yeah.
so that's what I meant. So don't get me wrong, like now, like that's one of the go-to tools I have for my mental health, my brain health, and so many things, my spiritual development, right? But when I was in the throes of like the darkest days of my concussion, that was really challenging for me. So what I found was a better approach. Again, not so much when we could talk about meditation from a spiritual practice and a
Right.
personal development practice, which is a different conversation. What I'm speaking more to is using meditation as a brain healing tool.
Mhm. Yeah.
What I've discovered is starting with the foundation of the nervous system first gives better results. Meaning, so I talked about the prefrontal cortex. I kind of consider that like the creme de la creme, right? The roof of your mansion, like the pinnacle
Yeah. Yeah.
of, human evolution and so on and so forth, right? But we also have these other areas of our nervous system, which I call the foundation. So this part is what we call, I'm pointing out this structure right here. So for those of you who are listening, it's like we have this outer covering of the brain, and then you can envision then we have a spinal cord, and
Mm.
in between the brain and the spinal cord is what we call the brain stem. And the brain stem is known as, in other circles, as the reptilian brain because even reptiles have this brain. It's all about survival.
Yeah.
What I found is with concussion and with trauma, that part of the brain, the survival brain, goes into overdrive. And so what ends up happening is like there you have the survival part of your brain we call the reptilian brain,
Mm.
right? Oldest part of our nervous system. And then we have this newer part of our nervous system called the prefrontal cortex. So it's like this reptilian brain, it's survival, right? It's, if there's like a nuclear fallout, guess what? That reptilian brain, it's like the cockroach of the nervous system,
Oh
right?
yeah.
Whereas you have this newer structure, and even when I say newer, it's both like evolutionarily newer, but also even in the development of human beings, our own development, it develops latest, right? The prefrontal cortex, meaning it's kind of sensitive, right? It's sensitive to trauma, the toxins, and things of that nature. So when there's a concussion or trauma, that reptilian brain goes into overdrive. And it's almost like there's this battle then, right? Between the higher parts of your brain and yourself, right? The prefrontal cortex, and then this brainstem reptilian brain. And guess who's going to win that battle? Almost always the reptilian brain.
Bible.
So, yeah, what I found is then rather than doing things like meditation as a starting point,
Mm.
it's best to do things at the foundational level to reset that brain system.
Yeah.
So part of that, I'm looking at my Instagram again. So I have another brain hack that's called activate your vagus nerve.
Okay.
And the cool thing is there's a part of the nervous system we call the vagus nerve that when you activate that, that can help put the brakes on that reptilian brain, put the brakes on stress. And when that happens, guess what? Then you start freeing up the higher centers of the brain, like your prefrontal cortex. Make sense? And
Right.
so I find that, that's a good starting point for a lot of people. So things like breathing exercises, right? Or things like You know, I do at this point now, I do like cold showers and cold therapy.
Yeah.
I don't recommend that for patients who are more or people who are more sensitive to start with,
Right.
but there's different ways where there's these physical activities you can do to strengthen and stabilize the foundation of your nervous system. When that happens, then you start freeing up space in your prefrontal cortex. And so it's kind of like a step-by-step process. You know, for me in my journey, it's like I found that doing these more physically based healing, you know, brain hacks were a
Mm.
lot more effective and faster. And then as I continued that recovery and I started to get my brain back, then when I started to do meditation, I got a lot more benefits from it. But again, that's from that neurological rehab perspective.
Mm.
I think when we talk about the spiritual aspects of benefits of meditation, right? Personal development, just the fact, you know, part of it is just sitting in your discomfort, right? You know,
Yeah.
that for me, it's like now that's how I use it. It's like, okay, if my mind's racing, I'm feel stressed out, my body's uncomfortable, being present to that and accepting that can be so powerfully healing. But again, what I found, at least in my experience and a lot of the patients that I work with, just trying to do that from a mental place using your brain versus more physically approaching it can be really exhausting and taxing.
I totally respect that. And back to that same analogy, let's say I really messed up my ankle running outside. I'm not going to want to go and put pressure on that. At first, it's like ice it, take care of it, really nurture it. And then as it improves, then start to stimulate it a little more.
Yeah, I love that analogy. Exactly. It's like even though we know running or jogging or walking is good for your health, if
Mhm.
you have a sprained ankle, it's not the best for your health. Like let that ankle heal first, you know? You got it. Awesome.
Definitely. Fantastic. I guess this next portion is going to be a little more rapid fire because we're getting closer to the time constraints. But I was interested about number one was the COMT enzyme. I noticed you did a YouTube video on that. I had very little knowledge on this enzyme that you were talking about, but how does it affect us in the different aspects of our lives?
Sure. So COMT is an enzyme that's really important for the processing of neurotransmitters. Okay. So remember how I was talking about Brody earlier, like the communication between our brain really determines our brain function and our experience of life, right? So part of that communication is electric. It's like an electric impulse, but then part of that is actually chemical and what we call neurotransmitters. And so we have neurotransmitters. They're really important for brain function, but just like the porridge, right? We don't want the porridge too hot. We don't want the porridge too cold. We want the porridge just right.
Right.
And so what this enzyme is, COMT, catechol-O-methyltransferase. This enzyme helps to detoxify enzymes and break down enzymes, or let me backtrack. This enzyme helps to break down neurotransmitters like dopamine and epinephrine.
Mm.
So, if, for example, we have too much epinephrine or norepinephrine, aka adrenaline, then you can just feel stressed all the time, just like you're constantly on the go, 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 go. No matter what you try to do, you can't calm down. And even if you sit down and try to quote unquote meditate, your mind's racing, or you're trying to sleep at night and you
Yeah.
can't get in bed because like you're thinking about all the things. Or if you get triggered and upset by something, it's like takes you forever to calm back down.
Mm.
That's an example of having one reason for that. There could be several. One reason for that is having too much adrenaline flowing through our brains. And so we have an enzyme that helps to detoxify the levels of that. That's what the COMT enzyme is. And so without getting too technical, everybody also has what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, or
Mm.
SNPs for short. And what these are, they're slight genetic mutations that can make these enzymes we have either work too fast or too slow, or the porridge is just right. Make sense? And so some people, if their enzyme is running too fast, guess what? we're actually then detoxifying the adrenaline too quickly. And then what we can actually end up having is not enough of that neurotransmitter. So a lot of times, then people experience things like brain fog, or really slow processing, or it takes them a while like pick up on things, or they just feel tired and they're not very mentally alert,
Mhm.
right? So because they don't have enough of that neurotransmitter, because this enzyme is working too quickly, right?
Got it.
Again, it's kind of complicated. There's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
Where the flip side of that is, if the enzyme is too slow, then you can have a buildup of adrenaline or norepinephrine and all the things that I described a second ago. But the cool thing is, there's actually natural things you can do to either, if your enzyme's too fast, you can slow it down, and vice versa. So for people who have, right, if they feel like they're just stressed all the time and just constantly on the go, 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 and one of the reasons for that is because the enzyme is too slow, then you can speed it up with something as simple as magnesium, right? So taking a magnesium supplement, eating a bunch of leafy green vegetables, or doing like an Epsom salt bath, you can increase your body and brain store of magnesium. By the way, magnesium is like one of the most important minerals. 60% people have deficiency in magnesium, and it's related to over 300 different enzyme reactions, including this one. So very important compound, right? So that's for people who, like, yeah, they might be overstressed because of that reason. And then for people whose enzymes too fast, and they don't have enough of that neurotransmitter, so they might feel sluggish, they might feel like depressed sometimes and
Yeah.
mentally just not alert. One thing you could do to speed up that process is actually, or actually rather to slow down that process, is actually to help with that, is eating more protein. So amino acids could be really good to help. Then what it does is not helps the enzyme work properly, but it also, like, proteins and amino acids are the building blocks of our, neurotransmitters. So I usually recommend people, especially if they're recovering from a brain trauma or concussion, I recommend animal sources of protein. So meat,
Yeah.
cleanest sources possible, usually like organic, grass-fed, are the best.
Fantastic. That's so informative, and I think it's a cool transition point about talking about caffeine. I think that caffeine is very beneficial, and uh however, once again, with over uh excitation in the brain, if I find myself, I'm very sensitive, and maybe it's because of my past injuries, or maybe it's just who I am as a person. But if I drink too much caffeine, I felt like I used to, when I used to take Adderall, like back in the days, like when I was drug usage. So I just want to know what your opinion on caffeine and how it impacts the brain.
Yeah, exactly. So, and you're absolutely right. Again, there's a lot of different ways we can approach it, but we're all unique, right? We have this biochemical individuality,
Mhm.
meaning that different things, like one thing that might work for you, might not work for everybody. And part of that, again, is because of this thing I mentioned a second ago, the genetic variations, the SNPs, right? And
Mm.
so caffeine, um, is, in order for it to be metabolized, we also need different types of enzymes. So some people, just again, their enzymes don't work as quickly, so the caffeine stays in their system a lot longer, and that can cause like jitteriness. It can cause like anxiety in some cases, panic attacks, even like racing heart and all that, right?
Yeah.
And so, but we also know that the benefits of things like organic coffee, as long as it's mycotoxin free, like free of molds, as well as things like green tea and black tea, there's a lot of these plant compounds that are known as polyphenols that are really healing for the brain.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, what I always recommend to my patients is, like, listen to your body. If you find that, downing a ton of coffee, like 5 cups of coffee, you're feeling jittery, then hey, try cutting it down to 1 cup. And if still that's the case, if you really need that kick, then try like black tea or even green tea and see if that's, easier on your constitution. So that's one thing that's, really important, is just to pay attention to your own body. The
Mm.
other thing is, sometimes it could be because there is like inflammation, or there's a the liver is one of the most important organs for detoxification. So if the liver is overburdened to begin with, then having that extra caffeine can overdo it. But again, for me, what I found, for example, I love coffee. So again, I always choose organic beans. I actually grind my own. I have this whole ritual that I do.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, over the pandemic, I'm like, I learned a new skill and became my own barista because we didn't go out that much, right?
Yeah.
And so I actually grind my own organic beans. I have like the little, filter, and I take this special kettle and I pour it really, slowly to release the flavors. But point being is like, you can choose like these different like sources of coffee or caffeine that aren't as harmful, like pesticide free, organic. But at the end of the day, you have to really listen to your body. So for me, yeah, if I drink like more than 3 cups, especially past 2 p.m.,
Yeah.
it's I'm not able to sleep at night, and it taxes what we call our adrenal glands. So again, it's about figuring out what works best for you.
Got it. Yeah, it's game over. That monkey mind will not shut off me as well at night.
Yeah,
So
exactly. I feel you, Brody.
yeah. I wanted to dive in a little bit to mixing Eastern and the best of both worlds, Eastern, Western medicine. And one of the things I was super curious about were acupressure.
Mm.
I think once again, we're talking about something that's way overlooked, in my opinion, that people can do. Can you talk a little bit about acupressure and how we could apply that to our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love acupressure. Just like with meditation, they're these simple tools that you could do anywhere, anytime for absolutely free, right? The key is learning how to use these tools. So, but acupressure, it's based on this idea that all throughout our bodies, we have these meridian or energy pathways. But it's cool because I had the unique opportunity to study acupuncture from a Chinese medicine perspective, looking at the subtle energies. But I also studied acupuncture from a neuroscientist from China, right?
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, so I learned it from both kind of schools of thought,
Yeah.
and you can like both are valid, right? One has over 5,000 years of, empirical evidence, and it just works in these systems. But then also our newer understanding of the brain and how these different reflex points and nerve bundles found throughout our body actually impact the nervous system, right? And so I found that acupressure could be a great at-home tool to help people who have um, common concussion symptoms.
Mm.
So a very common concussion symptom or trauma after trauma is like screen intolerance, right? Where if you're on screens too long, you start to get brain foggy or maybe a headache. And
I
there's actually,
well,
yeah, exactly. There's acupressure points found throughout the face as well as the body and the shoulders that can help with that. So a very powerful one is actually if you're feeling your eyebrows,
mhm.
right? So on the inside portion of your eyebrows, right above the bridge of your nose, if
Mhm.
you just take your fingers and gently massage around the bridge of your, so take your fingers along the bridge of your nose and massage upwards to your eyebrow, you might feel some tenderness there, right? And then you can kind of start tracing your eyebrow and tracing along. And for those who, and again, if this is your first time doing it, be gentle because we don't want to cause any harm. But if you can actually, if you like, I've trained my fingers to be able to perceive very subtle, changes. But there's actually a place, what we call the supraorbital notch.
Mm.
It's this little indentation right above the bridge of your nose on the inside portion of your eyebrows. So if you feel just gently, it's hard if you've never done this before, it might be hard for you to find it, but just feel around. But you might feel this tender spot, and you might even feel this little indentation. That's where a really important nerve comes out. And for a lot of people with brain fog or headaches or migraines, this point is really tender. So I'm actually even feeling this myself right now. And yeah, mine's a little tender too, because I've been on Zoom calls all day. So even for people who don't have headaches, this is a great kind of self-care ritual. If you find yourself on screen, who isn't these days on your phone a lot or on Zoom or on the computer or TV, this is one of many points that you can just gently massage. And again, the key is gentle pressure. So once you found that spot, you can just do gentle circular motions. And for some people, when they do this, they might find that, oh my goodness, this is triggering my headache. Well, guess what? This can be a game changer for you to just, over time, I recommend up to like 30 to 60 seconds, just gentle massage, like once or twice a day can be really powerful. But there's, like I said, that's just one of many different points that you can do to help with that.
Kind of like the brain hacks. So diverse there. I had a few more burning questions before I let you head out of here. I was so curious about how sulfur might be back on the nutritional front, how sulfur is beneficial for our brain and nervous system.
Yeah, so sulfur is a compound that's found in a lot of different types of vegetables, right? So things like garlic's really high in sulfur, things like eggs. And what we're finding is sulfur's a building block for a lot of substances that help detoxify our bodies from toxins.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, exactly. So sulfur containing foods, so things like garlic, things like eggs, egg yolk, things like asparagus, really high in sulfur. And our bodies then use sulfur to make compounds that can clear your brain and body of toxins. So yeah, that's why having a really wide variety of different foods can be helpful, but also foods that contain, high levels of sulfur as well.
Fantastic. And what's the difference between soluble fiber and insoluble fiber?
Yeah, sure. So when we talk about or brain health, one key area of the body that's crucial is the gut, the digestive system, right? And because it's all connected. Actually, part of my recovery from my concussion was healing my gut. And so there's a lot of different things you can do for that, but so insoluble fiber is fiber that we can't actually break down and digest, but it's beneficial because it helps to feed the bacteria in our guts, right? And it helps to clean out, waste products, and it keeps us regular. Because if we have a buildup of toxins, if we're not regular or we don't have a healthy, what we call a microbiome, like healthy bacteria in our gut, that can lead to inflammation, not only in the gut, and digestive symptoms like constipation or gas or diarrhea or bloating, but it can also, believe it or not, lead to brain dysfunction, right? So that's a really important thing. So there's different types of fiber sources people probably heard about that can be beneficial for healing not only the gut, but also the brain.
Got it. Well, doctor, it's been absolute pleasure on my end. You're kind of like a guru in my opinion because you combine the best of both worlds, and it's really awesome. You're kind of like a Zen master in a way, like who's also a doctor and knows all of this stuff about the brain. So, thank you so much for coming on. And I wanted to give the listeners a chance if they wanted to reach out to you. Where can they find you?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, brainsave.com. And yeah, you can find information. I have a blog on there. I'm also on YouTube, Instagram, as well as Facebook.
Fantastic. Well, I'll leave you with the last words here, and we'll dial out.
Yeah, so that's the thing. I totally get it. How if you are struggling from trauma or a concussion, how things could feel discouraging, right? It's a process of healing and recovery. But the great news is if you can get to the root cause of why you're experiencing your symptoms, healing is possible. So never give up, right? Always keep hope and keep fighting the good fight.
Wonderfully said. Everybody have a fantastic rest of their day.